Well, tonight we're going to look at Ruth chapter 3, verses 2 through 5. And this is probably the most important passage in the entire book. It's also the most difficult passage in the entire book. It talks about a plan that Naomi had that apparently she created on her own that is unprecedented anywhere. So we're going to look at that and try to make sense of that tonight. Just a quick review. In Act 1, which is chapter 1, that's where the problems take place. Naomi loses her husband. She also loses her 2 sons in the land of Moab. She comes back to the land of Israel with only her daughter-in-law, Ruth, who happens to be a Moabite. Chapter 1 ends with some good news. After all the bad news, there is some good news. It's barley harvest season when Naomi arrives back in the land of Israel, which brings us to Act 2, which is the search for short-term security. Naomi comes back as a widow. Ruth shows up in Israel for the first time in her life. She's also a widow. And in the ancient world, you did not want to be a widow, because if you were a woman in the ancient world, you literally needed a man to take care of you. It's just the way it worked back then. And so it was the man's responsibility to provide for the family, and these 2 women have no one to provide for them. So they come back to the land of Israel, and there's no way to make money. There's no job. So Ruth decides that she's going to go out and glean in the fields, and hoping that somebody would show her favor and she can bring back some grain that they can then make into food. Because otherwise, they're going to starve to death if something doesn't happen. So Ruth ends up in a field that's owned by a man named Boaz. Bethlehem is a small village, not a lot of people. So a lot of gossip about who's this Moabite woman that Naomi brought with her back from the land of Moab. So Boaz has already heard about Ruth before he meets her. And he understands that she was very kind to Naomi. So he returns the favor in abundance. He allows her to glean in his field throughout the barley season and the wheat season. And not only that, he tells her to stay close to his female servants. That way she can blend in with the women. No one would harm her. Also, that gives her first rights at gleaning. Whatever they miss, whatever they leave behind, she's right there to pick up for herself. In fact, Boaz tells the servants to intentionally leave some stuff for Ruth. And Boaz also talks to the men and tells them, stay away from her. Don't touch her. Don't harass her. Don't humiliate her in any way. And the boss has spoken. And so Boaz is just being incredibly kind and generous to Ruth. So much so that she goes home that first day with about 25 to 30 pounds of grain, which would have been enough food for about 2 months. And she gets to go back throughout the barley harvest season, the wheat harvest season. So this problem of their short-term security has been solved. Boaz will make sure that neither of those women starve to death. But Act 2 ends with this statement that Ruth is living with her mother-in-law, Naomi, which, in one sense, she's safe, but for a young woman living with your mother-in-law, not the best solution in the world, which leads us to Act 3, which is the search for permanent security. So Naomi realizes that Ruth is living with her, and ideally, Ruth should get married. And so Naomi's thinking, I've got to get this girl married, because Ruth's father's back in Moab. He can't do anything for her. The only relative that Ruth has in the land of Israel is Naomi. And back then, most marriages were arranged by parents. So she kind of has the responsibility of finding Ruth a husband. And that would give her permanent security. Better to live in the home of your husband than in the home of your mother-in-law. That's kind of the theme of chapter 3. There are 3 scenes in Act 3. In the first scene, which we're going to finish tonight, there's a conversation between Naomi and Ruth that happens in Naomi's house, and Naomi comes up with a plan. Now, it's interesting, in Act 2, it was Ruth who had the plan, and her plan was to go glean. Naomi's plan is to find Ruth a husband. So this is kind of like the big thing in this story, that somehow Naomi has to find Ruth a husband. And she does have a plan. And then the main scene is in chapter 3, verses 6 through 15. It will involve Ruth and Boaz. It will take place at the threshing floor where they're winnowing the grain. And it's more of a private encounter between Ruth and Boaz, which we'll explain. And then finally, Naomi and Ruth get back together again at Naomi's house. And Naomi says, okay, what happened? Tell me everything. So that's what happens at the end of chapter 3. And it's interesting that this whole act takes place one evening until the next morning, about a half a day. So all of this action takes place in a very short period of time. Well, it begins with scene 1, where Ruth is going to accept Naomi's plan. It's Naomi's plot to find her a husband. And verses 1 through 5 are interesting because Naomi begins talking in verse 1, and she talks all the way to the end of verse 4. So she dominates the scene. And then Ruth finally talks in verse 5. In the Hebrew, Naomi speaks 53 words. Ruth speaks 4 words. So this is all Naomi's plan, to find Ruth a husband. So that's the agenda. And it becomes very clear in verse 1. We looked at this last week, but just a quick review. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." So she takes it upon herself to find her a home. What does that home look like? Well, we're given a clue back in chapter 1. This is Naomi talking to both Orpah and Ruth after their husbands have died. And Naomi says to them, "May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." So for a woman in the ancient world, you needed to find rest and security in the home of a husband. And so Naomi's going to take it upon herself to find the home. She knows the problem. Real simple. Ruth needs a husband. And Naomi says, I'm going to take initiative. I'm going to make this happen. And beginning in verse 2, she begins to understand and lay out the plan. And it says, "Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor." Now, in the Hebrew, this is actually a rhetorical question. The NIV has translated it as a statement. So in the Hebrew, it would sound something like this. "Now, isn't Boaz our relative, whose female servants you were with?" So that's the question. And of course, Ruth's going to say, "Yeah, you told me several times now that Boaz is our relative." In fact, we, the reader, have known that Boaz is a relative of Naomi since chapter 2, verse 1. Boaz and Naomi's husband, who passed away, Elimelech, are related in some way. And back in the ancient world, if you were related, you kind of had an obligation to look out for your fellow relatives. And even though technically, because it's on Elimelech's side, Boaz really doesn't have to do anything. But we find out he's a generous, kind man who's willing to do something. It's also interesting how the NIV translates this. "Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked." They should have translated that female servants instead of women. Because today, if you talk about somebody's woman, you're either talking about their wife or their girlfriend. We're not talking about Boaz's wives or his girlfriends. We're talking about the female servants. And Ruth knows them because she follows them every day as she gleans. So she knows exactly who they are. And of course, Ruth knows Boaz is a relative. Tonight, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Now, Naomi is familiar with agricultural season in the town of Bethlehem and how that works. And perhaps she's been into town, into the village, talking with other women about what's going on. And maybe some of the women had said to her, oh, it's winnowing season. And that means my husband's got to spend, the entire night out in the field. Because the men would sleep out in the field during the winnowing season, because that's when you harvest the grain. And that's when thieves would really want to steal the grain. So they would actually sleep out in the fields in order to guard the grain from thieves and also potentially animals as well. And so Naomi knows, oh, Boaz will be out there too because he's the landowner. So he's going to oversee and supervise all of this. So I know for sure that Boaz is going to be out in the field by the threshing floor, and that's where he'll sleep that evening. Now, threshing means it usually takes place right after the harvest, and it's removing the grain from the rest of the plant. And so as you harvest it, you simply remove the grain, but then you have to winnow the harvest. And the best way to explain that is they would take the grain and throw it up in the air, and the wind would blow away the chaff, and the true grain would fall to the ground. And today they do that by machines, but back then they kind of did it on a threshing floor, which was kind of like a slab, and they would throw it up in the air. The wind would take the chaff, and what was left was good. That was the grain. Now in Bethlehem, you could get some gusty winds in the early morning or also in the afternoon hours, but in the evening, the winds were really calm. So it could be that Boaz waited until late afternoon, early evening to start this winnowing process because he could get the calmer winds. That way his harvest doesn't get blown away, and he ends up with a lot of grain. So that's kind of the process that's going on. And again, Boaz, the landowner, he's going to be out in the field that night, sleeping by the threshing floor to guard his grain, which normally that didn't happen. They would go out at the beginning of the day, and they would work in the fields all day until the sun went down. Then they would come back to the village. Because in the village kind of set up on a hill on purpose for protection. There's a wall around the village, and there's also gates. And at night, they locked them, protecting everybody on the inside. So if somebody tried to attack them in the middle of the night, they would have to find a way over the wall or through the gate. So it was a safe place to be inside the village during the night. But on this occasion, because it's winnowing season, the men have to sleep out in the fields. So with that background in mind, Naomi has a plan. And she begins to tell Ruth what her plan is in verse 3. So she tells her to wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. So she is to wash, she's to take a bath, she's to make sure that she's very clean, and then she would anoint herself with oils, probably olive oil that had a fragrance. It was kind of perfume back in the ancient world. And then she would put on her best clothes. We really don't know what her best clothes may have looked like. Now, obviously, when she goes out to glean in the fields every day, she's wearing her old clothes, her ratty clothes, because she's going to work all day. And when she's out in the field, she's probably not putting on perfume or fragrance because she's just going to sweat all day and get, really stinky like the guys. So she's not going to do that. And we really don't know, when she came back from Moab, what clothes did she bring with her? Maybe she had a nice robe-type dress that she brought back from Moab. We really don't No. I'm sure that when Ruth heard, put on your best clothes, she knew exactly what article of clothing Naomi had in mind, but we are not told what that looks like. It's also interesting at this point to talk about a process of mourning in the ancient world. And the author of Ruth doesn't tell us that Ruth is still mourning her husband, but it's a possibility that she is. We're not sure of the time gap between when her husband passed away and where she is right now. It could have just been a few months ago. So Ruth may still be in the mourning process. And maybe her clothing that she wore kind of gave the impression to people, I'm in mourning, I'm in grief, I'm not interested, in normal life. I'm not interested in finding another man at this point. That's a possibility. And we're not told what that looks like necessarily, but we know that for Ruth, that could be true. But for her to wash and to put on perfume and to get dressed in her best clothes, we do know that Boaz has never seen her in that way before. So this will be a new experience for him. And then once she does all of that, she's to go down to the threshing floor. And again, the village itself kind of sits on a hill, so you literally would go down, your elevation would be down into the field. The fields would have been much lower than the hill where people lived. So she goes down to the threshing floor. Now, this is interesting because women don't normally leave the village after dark. Because after dark, somebody locks the gates. And the gates are locked until the next morning when they're open. So basically, when all of the workers from the field come back into the village, the gates would be locked. And they would stay locked until the sun came up the next day and people would want to go out to the fields again. Now, it was quite common back in the ancient world, if you were a woman, that when the gates are locked, you're inside the village. It would be very dangerous for you to be out in the fields alone. Wild animals could be out there. Bad men could be out there. It could be a very dangerous thing for a woman to do that. But yet, Naomi is telling Ruth to go down to the threshing floor. And down at the threshing floor are only men. So this winnowing process is done by the men. Women are not involved in that. Women are back home in the village. So it's only men. But when you do this, don't let him know you're there. So Naomi is telling Ruth, you have to be like a spy. You need to go spy on Boaz, watch his every move, but don't let him see you. And for that matter, don't let any other man see you either. So you have to hide, but you have to keep an eye on him at the same time. So these are the instructions that she's given. Now, the men, they would winnow the grain until the sun went down. Then they would enjoy a very nice meal. They would celebrate. They would laugh and joke and give God praise for a harvest. And then it would be time to call it a day. They would go to sleep, and they would sleep there on the threshing floor to guard their stuff, to guard the grain. Then they would wake up the next morning when the sun came up and start work all over again. So that's what's going on. Now, that's a really strange thing to do. And it raises a lot of questions about why would Naomi want Ruth to do that? I mean, especially since Ruth is your meal ticket. Ruth is the one who goes and gleans, not you. So you don't want anything bad to happen to Ruth. Otherwise, you're destitute. You have nobody to take care of you. So what message is Ruth trying to send to Boaz by doing this? And there's three possibilities that people have suggested. Some of them are a little bit more likely than others. Some of them are R-rated. Some of them are a good Hallmark movie. So let's start with the first one. Ruth's actions suggest those of a prostitute in terms of what she's doing. And it's interesting that the idea seems to be that Ruth is going to go to the threshing floor, eventually meet up with Boaz, and try to seduce him. That seems to be the impression that you could get in reading this. Also, some of Naomi's terms, they're general terms, but they also have double meanings. And the double meanings have sexual overtones to them. And so she uses words like know, K-N-O-W, lie, enter, and uncover. And all of those words in the Hebrew had sexual overtones. Some people go as far as to say that Naomi's plan is for Ruth to seduce Boaz, get Boaz to sleep with her, hopefully impregnate her, and force his hand in marriage. That, for many, is Naomi's plan. Now, the problem with that plan is it's rather deceptive to begin with. Also, it doesn't really show great character, and it doesn't sound like a plan that God would have given her. Now, is there any credibility to the plan? And the answer is yes, because everybody in the village knows that down on the threshing floor, there's only men. And their wives and girlfriends happen to be locked up in the village. And so the prostitutes would often go out and offer themselves to the men. And keep in mind, this is the period of the judges. Israel was a mess. They were not following God's law. They kept getting into trouble because they weren't keeping God's law. So for prostitutes to be doing this is kind of in keeping with the moral leniency of the period of the judges. So it is a possibility, but it's not likely. And it's not likely because of verse 9, which we'll eventually get to. Boaz is going to eventually ask who the woman is. And Ruth's answer to him gives no indication whatsoever that she's trying to seduce him. If she was trying to seduce him, she could have at that moment, but she didn't. So that possibility, probably not. There's a second possibility that she's presenting herself as a bride for a wedding. I mean, she washed, she put on perfume, she put on her very best clothes, and she's presenting herself as a bride. The problem is the text never says that this is bridal clothes. There's no mention of jewelry either, so that's probably not true either. There's a third possibility, and that's the fact that Ruth is now dressed differently. She's not dressed as a widow in mourning or in grief. She's clean. She's got very nice clothing on. She has nice perfume on. And she's not mourning her husband. If she was in grief, she would never wear the perfume. Also, chances are she would never wear nice clothes either. It would always be kind of like rags. In fact, many of them wore sackcloth and ashes when they were in grief. So Ruth may be presenting herself to Boaz as a potential bride, as someone who's no longer grieving over her husband, someone who's returned to normal life, someone who is open to a marriage possibility. And that seems to fit the context the best. Well, moving on to verse 4, things get a little strange. I mean, if you thought verse 3 was a little strange, verse 4 is even worse. The first thing that Naomi tells Ruth is, when he, meaning Boaz, lies down, note the place where he is lying. So in other words, when Boaz decides to call it a night, and chances are he's going to enter into some kind of shelter, perhaps a tent, where he's going to spend the night. Make sure you notice which tent Boaz goes into. Now, it's beginning to get dark. And don't let anybody see you, but you need to make sure you get the right tent. Because if you go into the wrong tent, the guy in the tent's really going to think you're a prostitute, and that's why you're in his tent, and then you're in big trouble. So you need to make sure you get into the correct tent. So, you got to keep an eye on Boaz. And when he goes into his tent, make sure you know which one it is. And then Naomi tells her to do 4 things. And the first one is to go or to enter. So she's supposed to wait till Boaz gets in his tent, then sneak up on the tent, make sure Boaz is sleeping, and go into the tent. Talk about being brave. Talk about risky. She's to sneak into the guy's tent. Now, there is a Jewish version of this story that says that Ruth waits until Boaz is snoring and then goes into his tent, which that may make a lot of sense. It'd be safe to go into the tent at that point. So she's to go into the tent. And that's going to take a lot of nerve to pull that one off. But it doesn't end there. Then you uncover his feet. And literally in the Hebrew it says, uncover the place of his feet. And scholars have basically concluded that she was to uncover his feet probably up to his knees. And chances are he's sleeping with some kind of covering on. So uncover that up to his knees. Why? Because it's going to get cold during the night. And the cold air will hopefully wake him up in the middle of the night. So you don't want to immediately wake him up, but at one point in the middle of the night, you do want him to wake up. And so you uncover his feet so that he gets cold, so that he wakes up. And then it says, and then lie down. And Naomi doesn't say where she's to lie down, whether it's at his feet or beside him or outside the tent. As it turns out, she lies down at his feet. So, this is the plan of what Ruth is supposed to do. This looks risky. It even looks highly seductive. Ruth is a Moabite. Moabites have a reputation for sexual immorality. And it's a reputation that all the Jewish people know about. Where did the Moabites come from? They came from Lot. Lot had 2 daughters. Lot's 2 daughters get him drunk and have sex with their father. And the eldest daughter names her son, she gets pregnant, the eldest daughter names her son Moab. And he's the father of the Moabites. And every Jewish person knows the story, which is why a lot of Jewish people didn't like the Moabites. Then there's Balaam, who was hired to curse the Israelites. And every time he tried to curse the Israelites, God forced him to bless the Israelites. And finally, Balaam gets frustrated and he says, the only way that you're going to get the Israelites, cursed is they have to sin. And so use the Moabite women to tempt them into immoral relationships, and then God will get mad and God will curse them. And so it was Moabite women. So you can imagine that in the land of Israel, these Moabite women have quite the reputation. So here's this Moabite woman. she's to enter the place where Boaz is sleeping, and she does so by preparing herself to look good and smell good. It's under the protection of darkness, and around midnight she's going to have a rendezvous with a man who has drunk wine, who may be very open to her advances if she goes that direction. And they're all alone, and everybody else is locked up in the village except for the other men who are sleeping in other tents. This looks a little risque, especially for Naomi to tell Ruth to do this. Well, it's not done. There's a fourth instruction. He will tell you what to do, and he is Boaz. So when the poor guy wakes up, he'll tell you what to do. And, now if Boaz was in on this with Naomi, that would be okay. But Boaz is not in on the plan. He's going to be the most surprised man in Bethlehem that night. And who knows how he's going to respond. Naomi is trusting the fact that Boaz is a man of character, he's a man of honor, and he's a relative. So she is trusting the fact that Boaz will treat Ruth in an honorable way. He won't do anything to harm her or to compromise her. And she's counting on that fact. And then Boaz will tell you what to do. Well, it's interesting that Naomi's scheme, and what a scheme it is, it's unconventional. I mean, there's nothing in the Old Testament that you can read to say this is how to trap a man. It's not in there. In Jewish culture during this time, there wasn't a book called How to Find a Husband 101 that has this plan in it. Naomi makes up this plan on her own. This is her plan. And we see it as incredibly strange. And maybe the people back in ancient times would have said, yeah, this is strange to us as well, that somebody would do this. So, marriage is normally arranged by the parents. That's the normal way to do this. But Naomi's desperate. They're winnowing the barley. Harvest is about over. When harvest is over, they have no given contact with Boaz. In fact, by this point, Ruth is probably not gleaning anymore. She probably has enough food for the year and she doesn't need to go back. In fact, gleaning could be over at this point. So she feels like she has to do something now or never. And Naomi's determined to do something and to do it now. And that's exactly what she's doing. Now, Naomi's plan also raises a lot of questions. Okay, Naomi is the mother-in-law, and we could even say mother at this point of Ruth. So why doesn't Naomi make an appointment with Boaz during the daytime and say, Boaz, you've really been kind to us. You've given us all this food. And you know about Ruth, my daughter-in-law. You've been so kind to her. You let her glean, and, we have more food than we'll probably ever eat. You have just been so great. And by the way, did you know that Ruth is without a husband? She's single. And Boaz, I hear you're not married either. So what do you think? Well, she could have done that, but it would have been very inappropriate in the ancient world. Naomi, trying to arrange a marriage, it was usually the father who did that. So the father of the woman would go to the father of the man, and the two of them would make a deal. But Naomi, being the woman, doesn't have the social standing that Boaz has. So to put him on the spot could be to humiliate him or embarrass him, and that would be very frowned upon in the ancient world. So a direct confrontation would be the wrong thing to do. Because what if Boaz doesn't want to marry Ruth? What if Boaz says, there's this other woman that I'm interested in? And then what if some of the people began to find out that Boaz said no to Ruth? Oh, that would have just swept through that village like a wildfire. And maybe it would have harmed Boaz's reputation, and Ruth, she would just want to leave town if that were to take place. Well, Ruth, there's another possibility. Why doesn't, Ruth, flirt with Boaz and, get to know him a little bit better? And, Boaz apparently invites her to eat with all of his workers during mealtime. So, hey, Boaz, can I have a word with you once the meal's over? Boaz, I've really loved being here in the land of Israel, but, I'm single. And, I kind of hear you are too. I thought maybe we could, date or something. I don't know if they dated back then. But again, Ruth is a foreigner, and Boaz is a landowner. She can't really proposition him. That would have been entirely out of question. Impossible. Can't do it that way. Well, Naomi's scheme is a gamble. You can picture Ruth inside the tent. She's uncovered his feet. She's lying down at his feet. Boaz is probably still snoring. But eventually he's going to wake up. And chances are when he wakes up, he'll smell the perfume, which at least he'll know that the person in his tent is a woman. Because remember why Boaz is out there. He's out there to protect the grain. I mean, there's a chance he wakes up and there's somebody in his tent and he's thinking, the person in my tent's trying to kill me and steal my grain. And chances are Boaz has a weapon right beside him, some kind of knife or sword that he could pick up and perhaps launch in the direction of the person in his tent. But if he smells the perfume, he's probably not thinking that. He may be thinking that whoever's there is probably a prostitute, because that was somewhat common in those days. And then what if Boaz thinks Ruth is a prostitute and proceeds to accept her advances, and then perhaps wants nothing to do with her afterwards? Or even worse, what if Boaz wakes up and thinks Ruth is a prostitute, which then he thinks she's an immoral woman, and he wants nothing of that, and from this point on, Boaz wants nothing to do with Ruth ever again. That could happen too. Or it could be, best case scenario, Boaz wakes up, knows a woman is in his tent, asks who she is, finds out it's Ruth, and whatever Ruth says next may give him a clue as to why she's there. And maybe he figures out exactly what's going on. And maybe he responds to her favorably. That's the hoped-for plan, anyway. Risky. Dangerous. I mean, Ruth could get raped or killed that night. Those were possibilities. Which leads me to verse 5 and a very strange response on the part of Ruth. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. That's not what I would expect. I expect Ruth to say, now wait a second, Naomi. Wait a second. You want me to do what? Now, you want me to go out into the threshing floor area and to sneak out before they lock the gates to the village and go to the threshing floor. And after they lock the gates of the threshing floor, I can't get back home until the next morning. And you want me to spy on this man named Boaz? And to watch every move that he makes, and at the same time make sure he doesn't see me and no other man sees me? You want me to do that? And then you want me to find out which tent he's sleeping in. And then you want me to wait till he goes to sleep, and you want me to sneak into his tent and uncover his feet and lie down. Wait till he wakes up, and then he's going to tell me what to do next. It's like, Naomi, are you crazy? I mean, what's plan B? Because plan A is really risky. I mean, this could be the end of me. But I'll do whatever you say. So Ruth doesn't complain. She doesn't even ask questions. She has a quiet trust in what Naomi tells her to do. And I was thinking that when it comes to what God wants us to do, we should respond to God in the same way that Ruth responds to Naomi. Whatever you want me to do, I'll do. Because often God may prompt us to share our faith with someone, and we may think, you want me to do what? You want me to invite that person to church? Oh, I don't think that person wants to come to church. Oh, you want me to volunteer for that ministry? Really? I'm not sure that ministry fits me. Or you want me to help that person? Oh, really? I'm not sure I can do that. I mean, we are normally people who can come up with 100 excuses as to why we can't do something. And Ruth could probably come up with 100 legitimate excuses as to why she shouldn't do what Naomi's asking her to do. But when God wants us to do something, we should have a heart that says, yeah, you want me to join that ministry? Yeah, I'll do it. Now, you're going to help me, right? But yeah, I'll do it. Whatever you want me to do, I'm willing to do. Naomi has a heart of quiet trust. Wow. We should have a heart of quiet trust in God. Whatever He wants us to do, we're willing to do. Well, scene 1 closes with a lot of anticipation. What's going to happen on the threshing floor that night? Naomi's incredible plan, will it actually come to pass? Or will Naomi's plan ruin Ruth's life? Well, next week is a business meeting. So, in 2 weeks from tonight, we'll explore what actually happens when Ruth tries to carry out Naomi's plan. Well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this story. Father, it's an incredible story. It's a fascinating story. And in many ways, it reminds us that sometimes you use incredible things, unheard of things, to do your work and to get your work accomplished here on this earth. And Father, it also challenges us to have a heart of trust in you. That instead of giving you excuses, we just simply do what you want us to do. Trusting you all the way, that you're going to help us do whatever you ask us to do. So, Father, may we have hearts of quiet trust in you, that we're willing to get out of our comfort zone and do what you want us to do. So, Father, give us opportunities, give us a vision, a dream of what you want us to do, and then give us the trust to go out and do it. I pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.